Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you very much for having me. Θα ήθελα πάρα πολύ να βγάλω την ομιλία στα ελληνικά, αλλά δυστυχώς όταν πρόκειται για επιστημονικά θέματα δεν μπορώ. Συνεπώς θα σας μιλήσω στα αγγλικά και μπορούμε, άμα θέλετε, να κάνουμε τις ερωτήσεις στα ελληνικά. So humans are embedded in social networks, and these networks obey very particular biological, psychological, sociological, and mathematical principles. And taking this into account offers us great opportunities to gain new insights into human behaviors and also to change the behaviors. We can use an understanding of social network structure and function for good, to intervene in online and offline networks in order to enhance our health and our well-being. I'm interested in real social networks, the kind we humans have been making and embedding ourselves in for tens of thousands of years. Real social networks look like this. Every dot is a person. Every line between them represents some kind of relationship. Who's friend, who's sibling, who's spouse, or coworker, or neighbor, for example. And to my eye, social networks are intricate things of beauty. And they are so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, that they have such a particular and regularly seen topological architecture. The structure of human networks, wherever you go around the world, looks like this picture that I'm showing you here. They have these universal properties that it has to be the case that the structure and function of human social networks is not a coincidence. These are very ancient things that we evolved to make, and they shape our lives in ways we cannot escape. In fact, humans evolved to make social networks with particular structures, and these structures underlie processes of social influence and information diffusion that you at ΜΗΤΕΡΑ Hospital and those of you listening are struggling with. These modern technologies of social media that we have made are grafted on top of this ancient structure and are in the service of this ancient structure. People's attitudes, decisions, and behaviors depend in quantifiable ways on the attitudes, decisions, and behaviors of others to whom they are directly and indirectly connected. And in fact, empirically, when you do experiments and study what happens, you find that this effect often stretches to 3 degrees of separation. In other words, that things that you do, for example, whether you gain weight, or whether you are kind to other people, or how happy you are, depends on your friends, and your friends at 3 degrees of separation. When it comes to germs, we're accustomed to thinking of that. In other words, right now you don't have COVID, and your friends has COVID, and you can have the intuition that that'll wind its way through the network and reach you. In other words, that your probability of becoming infected depends on what's happening in terms of the infection status to people far away from you that you don't even know. It's similar with many other social phenomena. In fact, a key idea about networks is that networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. If you put something in a network, the network functions like a social magnifying glass and makes more of it. There was no COVID in Greece in 2019, and no COVID would have arisen until you inserted it into the network. If everyone lived like hermits, σαν ερημίτες στα βουνά, if everyone was separated from everyone else, there would have been no epidemic. But because we were connected, and connected in a particular way, as soon as you put the COVID germ into the network, you get an epidemic. And the nature of that epidemic of germs, surely, and of many other social phenomena, depends on the structure and function of human social networks. But networks are agnostic. They don't care. They will magnify fascism and violence and misinformation and Ebola. But equally, they will magnify love and kindness and happiness and ideas. And the question is how to exploit an understanding of networks to tilt the balance towards the more positive outcomes. Now, experiments over the past 10 to 20 years have identified three broad ways to intervene in networks so as to enhance public health and public policy and to use social networks for good. And I'm going to talk about all three of these just briefly today in the 35 minutes or so that I have. One thing you can do is manipulate contagion. In other words, you say, okay, here's the structure of the network. Where should I inject a piece of information or a behavior so that the flow of that behavior is optimized? What you're trying to do in a contagion intervention is to change the flow through the system. You accept the architecture. You say, okay, here's the structure of the social network I'm dealing with. People have their own friends, they have their own spouses, they have their own families. Where do I put the information or the behavior or the germ, if you're a bioterrorist? Where do I put that to get the most flow in the system? A second class of intervention is connection. Here you try to change the structure of the network. The idea here is you want to broker connections between people. For example, if you think about interventions, health interventions like Alcoholics Anonymous, you take a group of people who don't know each other, you bring them together, you form connections between these strangers, and those new connections make it easier to enhance sobriety in these people, to have a particular health outcome. Or you take a group of teenage girls who weren't previously connected to each other, and you connect them with social media in a particular way, and now you have mental health problems you didn't have before. So the connections can affect the outcomes, the actual structure of the network, and I'll show you that too. And last, I'm going to show you some very new work we've done with position interventions, where you change the location of people within the network, and some work we've been doing using artificial intelligence. Here the idea is, imagine you are a teacher and you have a classroom and all the desks are nailed to the floor. And nobody's sitting in them. And then outside the classroom, you have 20 students of differing abilities. Some are smart, some are not so smart. And now you have to decide. And so the structure of the classroom, like the positions, who's going to be whose neighbor. This chair is in front of this other chair, in back of this chair. It has these other chairs on either side. That's all determined. The desks are nailed to the floor. And now you have some students outside the classroom, and you have to decide where to seat them. Do you put the smart kids in front? Do you put them in back? Do you mix them up, for example? And accordingly, how much learning takes place in the classroom. So the network is the same. The structure of interactions is specified. The people are the same, but now you're manipulating where those people are located within the network, and that type of position intervention can affect the properties of the whole classroom, of the whole group. So these are three categories of interventions in social networks that I'm going to talk to you about, and there's expanding science in all of these areas in both online and offline settings. Let me give you a little feel for some of our results. This was a very early experiment we did to isolate social contagion. This was published in 2010. In this experiment, we brought college students who were strangers to each other. They did not know each other. Each student is indicated by a letter on this image. And they were randomly assigned to groups of 4 strangers. So the students were put together, and then they were given a little bit of money, and they were told to play something known as a public goods game. So if each student contributed money to the group of 4, like $1, we would double the dollar, and then it would be divided amongst all 4 students. So the group as a whole would get richer. They would get $2 for the $1 contribution, but the individual making the contribution would give $1 and only get back $2 divided by 4, or 50 cents. So they would have to make a sacrifice for the group, each individual. So of course, from an individual perspective, the best thing to do is not contribute. Hope everyone else contributes. You give nothing. But of course, if everyone does that, then the group collapses. There's no kindness in the group. And the best thing for the group is everyone to contribute maximally, because then everyone is doubling their wealth. That's a public goods game. So we put these people in these little social dilemmas, and they would play this game, and then a bell would ring, and then they would play the game again, and then a bell with new people. They'd be randomly assigned to new people. And then a bell would ring, and they'd be randomly assigned to new people. And we created simple, artificial, linear networks, as shown on the right-hand side of this image. And what we were able to show is that the effect with respect to altruism spread across people, and as a separate matter, persisted across time. So look at the red highlights in this image. What we showed was that if Eleni was kind to Lucas in period 1, Lucas was kind to Erica in period 2, Erica was kind to Jay in period 3, and Jay was kind to Brecken in period 4. And what this means is that the behavior spread to 3 degrees of separation. This is one of the more bizarre results to come out of my lab in the last few years. Because what I've just told you is that how Jay treats Brecken depends on how Eleni treated Lucas, even though neither Jay nor Brecken ever interacted with or saw Eleni or Lucas. So how people in our society treat each other, how these two people over here treat each other, depends on how those two people treated each other, even though neither of these people even knows those people. And here we've shown a contagion of altruism experimentally. The cause must be this spreading process. This geodesic through the network spread of kindness is distinct from the temporal persistence of kindness that's highlighted in yellow. In other words, when Eleni is kind to Lucas, Lucas learns to be kind, and then he's kind to Erica in period 2, and Lucas is kind to Lysander in period 3, and to Bemi in period 4, and so on, as highlighted in yellow. So these two different effects, the geodesic through the network effect, the interpersonal effect, and the temporal effect, when combined, function as a kind of matching grant. For every extra dollar Eleni gives Lucas, the network doubles the downstream benefits in this situation. So pay it forward is real. The contagion of altruism is shown here experimentally. But real-life networks are not simple chains. Real-life networks afford people within them different possible structural positions. This is a real network of 105 human beings. Every dot is a person. The lines represent social relationships. Here, who is whose friend is indicated. And I want to highlight the fact that different people within the network have a different structural position, are in a different spot in the network, and we can use a variety of mathematical tools to define those structures. I'm going to show you 3 very simple tools right now. So the easiest tool is just to count the degree of a node, the number of connections that a person has. So if you look at node B in the upper left, that person has 4 connections, highlighted in light blue. And if you look at node D on the far right, that person has 6 connections, highlighted in light blue. And that's a very simple property. And most people know this about themselves. You know, you have 10 friends, you have 8 friends. I have no friends. People know this about themselves. But there are also other more complicated features of network position that people may not know about themselves. For example, compare node C in the middle of the network to node D on the far right of the network. Both of those people have 6 connections. But we, with a bird's eye view, can see that nodes C and D are different. And I can cultivate this intuition in you by asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? You'd rather be D. You have the impression that D is on the edge of the network. They're going to be less likely to get whatever's spreading. And if they get it, they're going to get it later in the course of the network. Conversely, who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip were spreading through the network? You'd rather be C. You're in the middle of the network. This middleness, this extent to which you're in the middle of the network is called the centrality of a node, and it can be quantified mathematically in a variety of ways. And last, if you look on the far left, nodes A and B, they both have 4 connections, the same number of connections, but the difference between those 2 nodes is that B's friends are not friends with each other, whereas if you look, A's friends are all connected to each other. So A's friend of a friend is back again a friend of A's. This is known as the transitivity of a node. Now we can exploit these basic ideas and perform experiments to manipulate contagion. For example, here's a paradigm of experiments that we've been conducting for the last 10 or 15 years on how one might do this. For example, in sets of villages in the developing world or on Greek islands, for example. But the same principles apply to classrooms or workplaces or hospitals. You have a network of doctors working in a hospital. How do you get these doctors to behave better, to prescribe better medicines, to practice in a better way? All of these, the ideas I'm going to show you, can be used in all of these settings: villages, hospitals, classrooms, and so on. So here are two villages of 100 people. And you can imagine on the right-hand side, picking 6 people at random, as shown in the yellow dots, to receive some kind of behavioral intervention. So you go into the village, you pick those 6 people, and you teach them about breastfeeding their children or vaccinating their babies, for example. Now, the usual perspective in public health is that you come back a year later and you measure what fraction of those 6 people have adopted the breastfeeding intervention you gave them. Maybe 3 of the 6 people have adopted the practice. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in response to treatment among the treated. I'm interested in response to treatment among the untreated. I want to know what everyone else in the village does when you give those 6 people the intervention. So maybe in this case, 3 of the 6 adopt, and they influence or persuade 3 of their friends in the village to also adopt, for a total of 6 people in the right-hand village adopting the intervention. In the control village on the left-hand side, where there was no intervention, maybe 2 people just by dumb luck happened to start breastfeeding their babies, for example. But now that we've begun to think about network structure, we can imagine choosing the 6 people in a different way. For example, instead of picking 6 people at random, we can pick 6 central people that have high centrality, like I showed you a couple of slides ago, located in the middle of the network. Maybe once again, 3 of those 6 people adopt the breastfeeding intervention, but because they're located in the middle of the network, they persuade 30 of their friends to adopt. So, same village, same intervention, same number of people targeted, 10 times the effect because of who you select within the social structure to target for the behavioral intervention. And in fact, we can experiment with different mathematical algorithms for picking such potentially influential nodes. Because part of the problem is that mapping networks is not always possible. It can be expensive or impractical or even unethical in some cases to map these networks. So the question is, how can we identify the influential people without having to map the network for the whole population? And it turns out there's a mathematical fact about social networks called the friendship paradox that is summarized in the observation that your friends have more friends than you do. I don't know if you knew this, but your friends, on average, have more friends than you do. The friends of randomly chosen people have a higher degree and have a higher centrality and are possibly capable of inducing greater spillover effects than the random people themselves. So if you pick the 6 yellow dots at random and then pick one of their friends at random, which would be the 6 orange dots, you would move necessarily more to the center of the network. And you can get an intuition about this by looking at the perimeter of the network. For example, if you look at the yellow dot, to be on the perimeter, you're on the perimeter because you only have one friend. So every person on the edge of the network is on the edge because they have one friend. So for all those people, you should see that their friends have to have more friends than they do. For example, if you look at the yellow dot at the bottom, he has one friend, but if you move up to his friend, that orange dot has, 8 friends. So his friend has more friends than he does. That's true for everyone on the edge of the network. And in fact, it's true for everyone throughout the network. And the beauty of this is that you can find the orange dots without mapping the network. You can go into a village, pick people at random, have them nominate their friends, and then deliver the intervention to their friends, and those friends will have a bigger impact than the original people. And here's one recent project of ours exploring this idea in rural Honduras. Our questions were, How do we move a whole village and not just individuals to change their behavior? Given a budget constraint, who do we target for public health interventions? Who creates the most spillovers to untreated people, and how can we exploit this? Now, our first project using this approach with 5,000 people in 32 villages was published in The Lancet in 2015, but we've since expanded and done quite a few other projects, and let me tell you about those. This project was a very large randomized controlled trial involving 176 villages in the western highlands of Honduras and over 30,000 people, with support from the Gates Foundation, the Ministry of Health in Honduras, and the Inter-American Development Bank. We mapped the face-to-face networks of all the people in all of these 176 villages, and then we gave them a 2-year maternal and child health intervention, a very standard public health intervention where healthcare workers went into the people's homes every month for 22 months to teach the women and others about breastfeeding, cord care, pregnancy danger signs, diarrhea treatment, respiratory illness, and so on. And here's the design of the study. So there were 176 villages on the left-hand panel. There were 176 villages, 30,000 people. We had an 8x2 factorial design. So we had 8 targeting percentages, the fraction of people in each village that we chose to give the intervention to: 0%, 5% of the households, 10% of the households, 20%, 30%, and so on. And then we had 2 targeting methods. Did we pick that percentage at random? We picked 10% of the people at random, or did we use the friendship nomination technique I just showed you? So there were 8x2 design. There were 11 villages in each cell. And what we theorized when we began the project was that the results would look something like shown on the right-hand panel. On the x-axis of the right-hand panel is the fraction targeted. What percentage of people do you treat with a maternal and child health intervention in each village? 0, 20, 50, 100% of the people. And on the y-axis is the percent that adopt the practice. And here we go only up to 50%, because with any intervention, or in fact with any infection, not everyone is susceptible to the infection or the intervention in a population. So for illustration here, we cap it at 50%. If the social effect were linear and there were no social effect, you would get the purple dotted line. So you target 100% of the people, 50% respond. You target 60% of the people, 30% respond. You target 20% of the people, 10% respond. And you would get this linear effect. But of course, we realize that that isn't how it works. People are influenced by other people around them. And what we expect is, in fact, the red dotted line, a social effect that's sigmoidal. So, for example, you target 20% of the people and no one adopts, you see at the bottom of that red line there, because none of their friends have adopted. You go into the village, you pick 20% of the women, you give them the intervention, but still none adopt because they're surrounded by people who haven't adopted. Until you reach a critical threshold, and now you have explosive growth in adoption. And now the social effect that worked against you before, suppressing adoption, now accelerates adoption. It's easier to persuade people to adopt on the right-hand side of that red curve because their friends have already adopted. We wondered whether we could document experimentally this red line, and furthermore, whether we could shift the line to the left by using friendship nomination and accelerate adoption so that, for example, by picking 20% of the people shrewdly, it would be as good as if we had picked 100% of the people, if you go straight up from 20%. This obviously would have a big effect because now we could treat 5 times as many people with our intervention. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. These are curves for 2 illustrative outcomes: the acquisition of knowledge that respiratory illnesses are prevented by hand washing on the left, and seeking care for a pregnancy danger sign on the right. The x-axis is the target dosage in the village as before, and the y-axis is a slightly different measure. It's the net change in the outcome compared to the baseline rate over the 2-year period. The blue dots and lines show the impact of increasing the fraction of targeted individuals on change in response from baseline, and the orange dots and line show the response under nomination targeting, and that line is shifted up and to the left. The reason the lines converge at 0 and 100% is because at 100%, it doesn't matter whether you're targeting at random or using nomination, everyone is being targeted. So the line is shifted up and to the left just as predicted, and we proved this for many outcomes related to maternal and child health. And again, friendship nomination is a scalable technique that doesn't require network mapping or extensive questions. Now, we're also experimenting with more powerful algorithms that are even easier to implement and also work by enhancing the response to treatment among the treated, not just the response to treatment among the untreated. The problem with friendship targeting is that it might irritate the random seeds. You go into a village, you ask people who their friends are, and you say, thank you very much, I'm going to give your friends an intervention. And the original people will say, well, wait a minute, what about me? So we had the idea of doing what we call pair targeting. You pick, let's say, 10% of the people at random, they nominate their friends for a total of 20%, and you treat those couplets, people and their friends. And the question is, can you shift the curve even further to the left using pair targeting? And we showed using a trial, we did this in Mumbai in India, in a very poor part of India, working with iron fortified salt to decrease neonatal anemia in babies and in mothers. Could we get these women to adopt iron fortified salt? And the answer is yes, we could, significantly so. This paper was published last year in PNAS. The citation is at the bottom. We had 50 chawls, 50 residential buildings, and they were randomly assigned to 3 different algorithms. People were chosen at random. 20% of people were chosen at random. 20% were chosen according to the friendship nomination technique, and 20% according to the pair technique. Here are 3 networks, from illustrative networks from 3 different residential units that are called chawls. And the size is, if you look at the bottom, across the bottom, the size, they're all about the same, 61, 66, 59. And then the number of targets is always about the same, about 20%. So the targets are shown with a little hexagon outlines. So on the far left, we picked 12 targets. On the middle, we picked 13 targets at random. And on the far right, we picked 8 targets at random in the hexagons. And then we look at how many people in these residential units, whether we targeted them or not. In other words, all the people, some of whom would have learned about it from the targeted. And here we see a very profound difference. In the random targeting, 7 people adopted. At the bottom, you see. In the friendship nomination, 12 people, more adopted. It's better. And in the pair targeting, 21 adopted. So you have a much bigger effect. Always the same number of people being targeted, but many more people are influenced using the pair targeting technique. Now, to be clear, we're affected in another way by social networks. It's not just what's happening around us that matters. The actual structure of the network also matters. Think about these 2 objects. As you all learned in high school chemistry, they're both made of carbon. And on the left, you have graphite, which is soft and dark. And on the right, you have diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are 2 key intellectual ideas, and these properties depend on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. And there are 2 key ideas here. These properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms. They're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them another way, and you get a completely different set of properties. And similarly, it's the pattern of our connections that affects the properties of social groups. It's the ties between people that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. New properties like cooperation or violence, or health or happiness, can emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. So it's not just what's happening in the people around us, whether they are altruistic or happy or breastfeeding their children, that matters. Our experience of the world also depends on the actual structure of the ties around us, near and far. Let me give you one of my favorite illustrations of this. This is work done by Brian Utsi at Northwestern University. Brian became interested in the success or failure of Broadway musicals. Now, Broadway musicals cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce and either make billions of dollars or they're a total flop and you lose all your money. So he looked at 326 Broadway musical production companies, the actors, the directors, the musicians, and so on, and mapped how they were connected internally and quantified something known as the density of the ties, which is similar to the transitivity that I introduced a few slides ago. So imagine you have 6 people, one in the cartoon on the far left, you have one person in the middle connected to 5 people. Among those other 5 people, there are 5 times 4 divided by 2, 10 possible connections, but none of them are present. So you have 0% transitivity on the far left. And then in the next cartoon over, you have 4 connections, or 40%. And in the next cartoon over, all 10 of the connections are present, or you have 100% density. What Utsi did is he plotted on the x-axis this density parameter, and on the y-axis, the success rate of the Broadway musical productions. And he measured that success either by the amount of money that the musical made or by the fraction of positive reviews. And he found this parabolic shape that's shown in the cartoon on the far right. Towards the bottom, at 0% density, if nobody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. And conversely, at the upper end, if everybody knew each other from before, the show was a flop. The optimal performance was achieved in the middle range of density. And that's because you need some new people to bring new ideas to the group who don't know each other from before, but other people who are familiar with working with each other to be able to have the group be effective. But the point is that the structure of the network was relevant. The organization itself has value. Now, in my laboratory, we've developed software that we call Breadboard that allows us to recruit tens of thousands of subjects online and create temporary artificial societies of real people that we can manipulate to do all kinds of experiments. Here's some work that we did that involving the manipulation of connection to affect how cooperative people in a group are. This experiment explored how the rules of interaction in a social system could affect its ability to produce a desirable property, namely cooperation among its members. We recruited 758 subjects to come to our virtual lab, and they were randomly assigned to different worlds to play a public goods game, like I described earlier, with strangers. So in the bottom, we created this network architecture that's shown in the bottom left cartoon, and then the experimental subjects were dropped into their locations, and they were introduced now to their neighbors. And they had to play a public goods game like the one I discussed earlier with their neighbors. The red dots are the defectors, the people that take advantage of their neighbors and don't give anything to their neighbors. And the blue dots are the nice cooperators that are generous to their neighbors. And then they played multiple rounds of this game over time. And on the bottom, you see the collapse, you see the tragedy of the commons. You see the collapse in altruism in the society. Because the blue people start being nice to their neighbors, but the red people take advantage of them. And the blue people get upset and they're like, why should I be nice to my neighbors if they're not nice to me? So they switch to being defectors. And by the end, almost everyone has become a red defector, except for a few blue people on the far right keeping civilization alive. In a different branch of the experiment, we manipulated connection. And in addition to having people playing cooperation and defect in each round, we also gave them the power to cut ties or form new connections with their neighbors. And in that branch of the experiment, you can see cooperation is sustained. My point is, I could take you people in the audience and I could connect you one way and you'll be really nice to each other. Or I take you same people and I connect you a different way, like the carbon example, and you'll be really mean to each other. So this property of niceness and meanness is not a property only of you yourselves, it's a property of how you connected to each other. The structure matters. Finally, here's an experiment involving the manipulation of position and exploring some other ideas involving artificial intelligence. Here we're exploring the performance of groups, for example, engaged in a coordination task. And this paper was published in Nature in 2017. So in this situation, people are put into a network and they are told that they have to work together to pick a color that's dissimilar from their neighbors. Each person is told you have to pick yellow, purple, or orange, but your job is to pick a color that's not the same as your neighbor's color. And on the far left, you can see the network in this experiment. We had 4,000 people in 230 different groups in this experiment. And you can see on the far left cartoon, on the far left, there's a little orange dot. And you can see that he's connected to a yellow dot and to another orange dot. And he's in conflict with the other orange dot, and that is highlighted by the red tie. So the red ties indicate people that are not coordinating with their neighbors. They have the same color as their neighbor. And what that orange dot should do is switch to purple. If he switches to purple, he won't be in conflict anymore with the orange or yellow dot. So people are put into this game. It takes 5 minutes. And they start switching their colors. Everyone only knows what's happening among their own neighbors. They don't see the whole network. So people start switching their colors, switch, trying to minimize conflicts. And we tell them that you will only be paid if your whole group works together to solve the game. Otherwise, you get nothing. On the bottom, we show the results of the experiment, of this run of the experiment. On the x-axis is time, as the time goes on as the people play the experiment in seconds for 5 minutes, 300 seconds. And on the y-axis is the number of color conflicts. And at the beginning, there are a total of 12 red lines, 12 conflicts where people are in conflict with their neighbors. And so people start switching their colors till they get to 105 seconds. And you can see at 105 seconds, there's only one conflict remaining in the middle. Everyone else has been able to work with their neighbors. But these guys, these two yellow dots, are stuck. They can't make a switch because they're locked in. Any switch they made to orange or purple would increase their conflicts. And that's a so-called unresolvable conflict, and that's indicated by the orange line, the orange bars at the bottom. Anyway, they start switching. One of them makes a change, and by the end, they have recolored the network and they have solved the problem. Now, what we did in this experiment, because we're sneaky, is we replaced some of the people with bots. And we endowed these bots in what we call a hybrid system of humans and machines. And you're going to be reading a lot more about these hybrid systems where you have doctors and AI doctors, and people can see real doctors, or they can talk to ChatGPT, for example. Or online, you're going to have real people and bots, for example. These are, or on factory floors, you're going to have real workers and robotic workers. Or in checkout, when you go to the grocery store, there are going to be real people checking you out or automated checkouts. So these are hybrid systems of humans and machines. And we created such a hybrid system in this experiment. And so some of the games had just humans, and some of the games had humans and some bots. And we endowed these bots with very simple artificial intelligence, deliberately simple. The human-only groups are shown in the orange line. In all of these panels, the orange line is the same. On the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is the probability that the group had not solved the coordination game. So we had 30 groups of humans, and at the beginning, 100% of those groups had not solved the coordination game. They just started. And as time went by, more and more of the groups solved the game, so that by 5 minutes, let's say 20 of the 30 human groups had managed to solve the game, showing in that declining probability of unsolved games in the orange line. And then what we did is we manipulated where we put the bots. On the top row, they're positioned at random. In the middle row, the bots are in the middle of the network. On the bottom row, they're on the edge of the network. And we manipulated a property of the bots, which is how noisy they were. We deliberately sometimes made the bots make some mistakes. And it turns out putting slightly noisy bots deliberately who make some mistakes, quote unquote, in the middle of the network, you get that purple line that's below the orange line. We can make the human groups perform better by adding bots with certain programming at a certain location in the network. In other words, the humans learn to play better by having the bots among them. And it's not just those humans who are directly connected to the bots. The bots help the humans to help themselves. And we're building on this work to design and add simple bots to these other situations listed here involving social dilemmas and collective action problems. And we want to explore various kinds of simple programming, what we call dumb AI, that will increase the ability of groups to coordinate, cooperate, communicate, evacuate, navigate, share, or create. We've done experiments in all these, and we can show that adding simple forms of artificial intelligence to group networks of people makes the people better able to do the things shown on this slide. Okay, I want to close with one final idea, which will take a couple of slides and just a couple of minutes, and then I'll be done. And this is the question of what does it mean when we intervene in social networks? Because I think such interventions that we've been discussing today provide us with a way to manipulate what's known as social capital. And to get one sense of this, consider this idea. What's the point of a connected life? How does it help us as individuals and as a species? And it turns out that networks are a resource we can all use. Networks are a kind of social capital. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use. Capital is a reservoir of wealth that you can do something with. And two further key ideas about capital are that in order to create capital, you have to invest skill and effort. You have to know something and do something in order to make capital. And second, and very subtle, that in order to create capital, you have to make changes in a substance that make it yield a higher rate of return than it otherwise would. That at its deepest, the capital creation process is about the transformation of the natural world. Working on the world to transform one thing into another is what capital creation is about. For example, a farm is a stock of capital. By investing labor and skill and clearing the forest, you make the land more productive of grains and vegetables and flowers, for example. So land, especially improved land, is a form of capital. Or for example, here you can take this tree and invest skill and effort and mill it into lumber. And the lumber is more valuable than the tree because you can do things with the lumber you couldn't do with a tree. Namely, invest still more skill and effort and make it a violin. And the violin is more valuable than the lumber because you can do things with the violin that you couldn't do with the lumber. Namely, make music. So at each step of the way, you invest skill and effort, you transform one thing into another thing, and that's what makes it a stock of capital, a reservoir of wealth, and a source of productive power. So capital is a change that allows the substance to act in new ways. Now, a key innovation in thinking took place in the 1960s in the social sciences to see people and their skills and talents as a form of human capital. And the chief example of this is education. I can take this former graduate student of mine on the far left who's a drunkard and clean him up and send him to Alcoholics Anonymous, and now he's much more productive. Or I can invest still more skill and effort and change the neurons of his brain and give him an education. And now he's even more productive. He's even more human capital. At each step of the way, we modify the natural world, here the brain of this person, and make them better, endow them with human capital. Well, just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital by a change in persons, social capital in organizations, companies, communities, hospitals, in villages, in our whole society, is a change in the relations among persons, a change that renders the group more productive and capable of doing things such as producing health that it was not previously able to do. And that is the deepest account I can give you of what social networks mean for our lives and why it is and how it is that we can use them to make the world better. Thank you.